In a week defined by diplomacy and urgency, President Donald Trump's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping became more than a discussion of tariffs and trade policy. It evolved into a moment that intertwined economics, national security, and the human cost of addiction. The conversation was framed by a pressing crisis that transcends borders: the flow of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that has devastated families across the United States. What unfolded was not simply a negotiation between two of the world's largest economies, but a dialogue between power and pain, leverage and loss. As cameras followed the president's return from the meeting, the story quickly shifted from the language of policy to the language of grief. Viewers heard from Steve Greer, a father who lost his daughter to fentanyl poisoning. His story, set against the backdrop of international diplomacy, reminded Americans that behind every statistic lies a family struggling to make sense of an unthinkable tragedy. The contrast between global negotiation and personal devastation underscored the complexity of modern leadership, a world in which trade decisions and tariff reductions can carry life and death implications. This moment represented more than the mechanics of diplomacy; it symbolized how deeply human emotion can shape foreign policy. A father's heartbreak, a president's determination, and a nation's search for accountability converged in one broadcast. The fentanyl crisis had become not only a domestic emergency but a diplomatic agenda item, proof that today's global challenges are never confined to a single nation's borders. President Trump's meeting with President Xi began as part of ongoing negotiations over tariffs, manufacturing, and trade balance. Yet, woven through the formal agenda was an issue that has haunted American communities for years: the influx of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths annually. The president announced that following discussions with Xi, China had agreed to take stronger action against the production and export of fentanyl precursors. In response, the United States would reduce certain tariffs on Chinese imports from 20% to 10%. The adjustment took effect immediately, signaling that the administration viewed China's cooperation as not just diplomatic progress but a humanitarian necessity. This was not a traditional trade concession. Instead, it reflected what Trump described as results-based diplomacy, the idea that economic relief would be conditional on measurable action. The president's statement, "Because of fentanyl coming in, big tariff," based on statements today, reduced it by 10%, suggested a tactical link between enforcement abroad and economic incentives at home. For the administration, this approach demonstrated both strength and compassion, using America's market power to confront a public health crisis that was claiming more lives than many wars. The emotional center of this narrative came from Steve Greer's interview. His daughter, Christina, was described as a bolt of lightning, a vibrant and resilient young woman who had overcome early hardships only to fall victim to an invisible killer. Greer's account of her final days, the swelling of her brain, the 12 days in intensive care, the long goodbye, pierced through the abstractions of policy debate. His story gave the crisis a face, and his description of fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction captured the magnitude of the threat. In his view, and increasingly in the view of policymakers, the opioid epidemic was no longer just a matter of addiction but a matter of national security. The interview also illuminated how ordinary citizens interpret government action. When Greer said, "I think we have the leverage," he voiced confidence that the U.S. could compel China to act through economic pressure. He praised the president's willingness to sit down and make a deal, while maintaining the power to snap back tariffs if promises went unfulfilled. His comments reflected a growing belief among Americans that foreign policy should produce tangible results at home: fewer overdoses, more secure borders, and a sense that their leaders are using every available tool to protect them. Beyond the fentanyl agreement, the meeting produced several trade outcomes that carried both symbolic and practical weight. China pledged to increase its purchase of U.S. agricultural products, particularly soybeans, a crucial win for American farmers who had suffered under earlier rounds of tariffs. The two sides also agreed to maintain the flow of rare earth materials critical to manufacturing and defense industries, preventing a potential supply crisis. These moves were presented as evidence that negotiation could yield balance, economic cooperation paired with national resilience. Supporters hailed the summit as a demonstration of pragmatic leadership, proof that the U.S. could use its economic leverage not only for trade gains but also for moral ones. Critics, however, questioned whether China's pledges would translate into sustained action. Previous administrations had secured similar promises to restrict fentanyl exports, often with limited enforcement. The decentralized nature of China's chemical industry and the rise of online black market sales make regulation difficult. Still, the White House's strategy of linking tariffs to verifiable progress marked a notable escalation, blending economic policy with criminal deterrence. From a broader geopolitical perspective, the Trump-Xi meeting also served as a reminder of the delicate balance in U.S.-China relations. Even as the two nations cooperate on certain fronts, they remain rivals in technology, military strategy, and global influence. For the Trump administration, reducing dependency on Chinese manufacturing while securing cooperation on public health issues represented a careful act of dual containment, challenge and collaboration in equal measure. The president's concurrent outreach to Japan highlighted this approach. Strengthened alliances in the Asia-Pacific region were meant to offset China's dominance while preserving stability. The administration emphasized that its foreign policy sought not confrontation but equilibrium, a strong America able to negotiate from a position of leverage rather than desperation. In this context, every agreement, whether on soybeans or synthetic opioids, became part of a broader narrative of renewal, restoring U.S. power, revitalizing domestic industry, and reclaiming the moral authority to demand accountability abroad. Yet, behind the strategy and symbolism, the human toll persisted. The fentanyl crisis continued to escalate, cutting across urban, suburban, and rural communities alike. In 2024 alone, synthetic opioids were implicated in more than 70,000 American deaths. For parents like Steve Greer, statistics offer little comfort. His grief became both a warning and a mandate, a reminder that public policy must ultimately serve the lives it seeks to protect. What made this story compelling was its fusion of the personal and the political. On one side, the grief of a father whose daughter's life was taken by a few milligrams of poison, on the other, the actions of presidents and policymakers navigating the high currents of global trade. Between them lies the reality of modern governance, that the choices made in diplomatic boardrooms ripple outward into hospital rooms, kitchens, and funerals. Trump's reduction of tariffs in exchange for fentanyl enforcement was, in essence, a gamble, a calculated risk that moral appeal and economic pressure could succeed where moral appeal alone had failed. It was a recognition that the flow of synthetic drugs could not be halted without confronting the global networks that enable them. For all its controversy, the policy symbolized an evolution in how nations define security, not just in terms of armies and weapons, but in the safety of their citizens' daily lives. Still, questions remain. Can China effectively regulate its sprawling chemical sector? Will reduced tariffs be enough incentive for long-term cooperation? Can the U.S. maintain pressure while avoiding escalation in other trade areas? These uncertainties define the fragile balance of modern diplomacy, where progress often arrives in cautious increments rather than sweeping victories. Yet the moral clarity of the moment remained undeniable. For millions of Americans, the idea that foreign negotiations could directly address a domestic epidemic offered a rare sense of unity between policy and purpose. It reflected a hope that the machinery of government, often distant and abstract, could still respond to the cries of its people. The story of President Trump's meeting with President Xi is, at its heart, a story about connection, the connection between global economics and human suffering, between the decisions of world leaders and the lives of ordinary citizens. It demonstrated that the boundaries separating diplomacy, commerce, and compassion are thinner than they appear. By tying tariff policy to action on fentanyl, the administration sought to transform economic power into humanitarian leverage, an attempt to make the tools of trade serve the needs of public health. Whether this approach will yield enduring change remains uncertain. The fentanyl crisis continues to test the limits of international cooperation and domestic resolve. Its causes are complex, its solutions elusive. But for a brief moment, the abstract world of geopolitics intersected with the tangible pain of a grieving father, and in that intersection lay a glimpse of what effective leadership can mean, not only defending borders or balancing budgets, but defending lives. Christina Greer's story lingers as both tragedy and testimony. Her death, like those of so many others, is a reminder that behind every headline lies a human cost. The hope that her story, and the actions it inspired, might prevent another family from enduring the same loss is what gives this narrative its lasting resonance. In the end, diplomacy is more than negotiation, it is empathy translated into action. The meeting between Trump and Xi revealed that even the most complex international issues are, at their core, about people, their safety, their futures, their right to live free from harm. If nations can align their power not just for profit but for protection, then perhaps the lives lost to fentanyl will not have been in vain. The measure of success will not be found in tariff charts or trade balances, but in the quiet victories of lives saved, families spared, and futures reclaimed.